Good afternoon. I would warn you this is a very different tour than quantum Monte Carlo, and it's not physics either. But it's a problem perhaps lots of us, in fact, understand. If you are into politics or voting, this is a classic problem of congressional redistricting. This is a North Carolina example. If you Google, this actually shows up in your perhaps one of the top searches. This is coming from a wiki page. The idea is, this congressional redistricting happens once a while. The idea is to organize the political redistricts so that people get fair representations, but oftentimes gets manipulated for political advantages. Like in this instance, people getting this very narrow and striped look like districts. This is a lot to do with minority representation. But the main idea here is what is referred to as zoning analytics. This is, in fact, a popular thing to be done by politicians, but as well as paid attention by general public. The idea is you partition a large number of geographical units into smaller number of units, in this case is districts. Sounds pretty simple, but turns out to be a hard problem. The problem nature is what is we typically refer to as a combinatorial search, because there are so many number of combinations across space. And this simply, if we're talking about math, it's Stirling number of the second kind, so it's combinatorial optimization we're talking about. It's NP hard. And the problem has attracted attention from political scientists, geographers, operational researchers, GIS people, geographic information systems, because this utility has been implemented as a GIS tool all across the board, used by many users to figure out the best solutions representing their interests. So in the broader context, this is also referred to as complex spatial decision-making problems. So you're making spatial decisions because there are many choices and you are optimizing for your objectives and having constraints. A lot of times, these problems are even EO-structured, means it's hard to define what exactly you want. You have to explore. You really have to interactively sift through what are options. And some options may not be perfect. Some options actually need to be refined as you are searching for solutions. So this example is a location optimization problem. Say if you want to select the best locations for bioenergy, biomass, refinery, here is a popular problem since we're in the state of Illinois. So this has economic impact, right? But also has environmental impact. So if you put a bioenergy processing facility somewhere, consumes water, your neighborhood may not like it. So how do you make decisions like this? And it's involving environmental data, population data, and the bioenergy data. So it's another example. I'm trying to tell you a class of problems we are concerned with just beyond political redistricting. Of course, that's the problem we are solving currently using Blue Waters. So again, if you're talking about real-world problems of reasonable size, you're not going to get exact solutions. That's a given fact. A lot of times, if you're informed by rich data, the problems are more complex, perhaps, than you could handle. So to summarize, we have to engage heuristics. One of the kind of heuristics is what people generally refer to as population-based heuristics. Genetic algorithms, popular one we looked into. But one of the major arguments we put together this study is that when we have Blue Waters, we have an opportunity to invent a new kind of genetic algorithm. So if you think of the literature of genetic algorithm that has been done in sequential computing and also parallelization, accelerating the evolution. But we see genetic algorithm by nature is a parallel algorithm because you see the populations as the solutions are evolving. That evolution really should be concurrent and therefore should be modeled as parallel computing processes. So we really take that into account and argue this is a new opportunity for a new kind of algorithm for this kind of tough problems. And very quickly, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with genetic algorithms, this is survival of the fittest. It's iterative algorithms going through many, many iterations. And you got some very basic operators such as selection, crossover, mutation, and so forth. But as you could see, we're solving spatial problems in our science, so we have to come up with the spatial operators. In this case, you sort of seed across your space some initial solutions. And these initial solutions, as they evolve, try to maintain feasibility because our solution space is really massive. We really have to be careful. I'll show you an example in the later stage. If we are not very careful, we are quickly going to some very ridiculous search. Our case study is Minnesota. Anyone from Minnesota? Wonderful. So 8 districts, right? That's fixed by law or whatever debate has been going on for decades. So 8 districts is our target. And if you look at what people do in practice, you really look at the finest spatial units should be assigned to a district. This normally happens, census tracts, blocks. But in the literature, people study this have to operate at county level and most of the voting districts level because of the power of computing and the reasoning in understanding this process. So because we see these spatial decision problems are actually quite a few across many geospatial domains, we had this effort developing a generic genetic algorithm library based on parallel computing. So this work is actually published. It's on parallel computing. You could go there to check out. It has more technical details and performance evaluations. But the idea is if we could model this genetic algorithm, the solution evolution as parallel processes, and we see individually each parallel process represents a subpopulation. And this subpopulation internally, they exchange their genetic makeups more frequently. But across the subpopulations, exchange the genetic makeups, the fittest solutions, less frequently. So it's quite a good fit for the blue waters, right? Internal to your course, you do intensive communications, but across the course, you do less communications. So we manage this hopefully in a scalable way, and I'll show you how we did that. One of the key strategies to model the parallel evolution of the populations in an asynchronous fashion. As we know, global barrier synchronization is a huge cost in a system like blue waters. You got hundreds of thousands of cores. You do a global broadcast exchange populations. That's very costly. So we started from the get-go, model this as an asynchronous communication. And turns out, if we, speaking of the technical jargons, MPI-IO does not have very good buffer management to enable application level asynchronous communications. So we had to come up with application level buffer management to make sure there's no overflow situations. Because the idea is you got so many subpopulations, they evolve and then once in a while exchange across the board with other subpopulations. And then there's buffer at each subpopulation to keep track of what's coming in as the better solutions and to replace or inject into the local populations. So the management of this buffer overflow situation and also completely asynchronous dynamic process, if you think of this as hundreds of thousands of subpopulations all happening concurrently, it turned out to be a very interesting problem computationally. So these are the kinds of parameters we're talking about. Normally you don't see from the genetic algorithm literature, talking about migration. Migration meaning, from one subpopulation to another. And in our case, that's a new element in this genetic algorithm on blue waters or massively parallel systems. Case study, Minnesota, as I mentioned, normally you see a study like this published, people trying to get 8 districts and, see which parts of the state belong to, which district. Now, we want to go to, say, census block level. This is a map. If we go to that level, how many combinations you really have to consider. Computationally, this is a huge challenge. Some computational experiments we're currently looking at voting districts and data. If you're a GIS person, you know what I'm talking about, a shapefile. This is ASRI stuff. This is topology, representing topology. Number of cores, we go up to 131K cores, and the smallest is about 30K. Weak scaling, because our argument is that this kind of algorithm is actually not a sequential genetic algorithm anymore. And as you go up the number of cores, you see for the most desirable solution qualities, you see very significant time dropping. That means larger amount of resources we use, we actually could achieve better for the desirable solution quality. So I was talking to you about what this means as the kind of solutions we could get. I showed you a perfect example, if we operate at county level like that. But if we are talking about the voting districts, this is an actual solution coming out of the later evolution of the genetic algorithm. You see, they're starting to be this sort of very small, penetration into this sort of large, less populated areas of Minnesota. But you could imagine there could be so many different kinds of spatial combinations for this kind of problem. And how a general public or politicians or whoever is going to be related to this process going to appreciate or understand and evaluate all the different combinations. So it's a very intriguing problem from that regard. Normally, you would configure this to have equal populations across all the districts. That's defined by law. And also, you want to have good minority representation. And one very hard criteria you cannot break, by also defined by laws, you have to be geographically contiguous for any district. So these are the constraints you would work with. There are many other factors you could define as also objectives. As I was alluded to, the primary benefit for us to come up with this approach to this problem is as you increase the number of computing resources, you literally also increase the possibility of generating more solutions. And the likelihood of coming with those solutions is the ability to be able to find better quality solutions. So these are some smaller experiments using smaller number of resources. You could see the quality of solutions are improving as you increase the number of computing resources engaged. And also, with the population size gets increased, you also have ability to find new solutions in this space, in the solution space. That's also an increasing trend. That is resonating with our argument from the experimental results. The parallel genetic algorithm not only having desirable scalability from the computational space, it is indeed promising to be a new instrument, a new methodology to provide better quality solutions for solving the tough problems we were looking into. So now I want to broaden this discussion a little bit, maybe next few minutes, why this is interesting as a blue waters problem. The process I was describing a lot of times is incorporated as a utility as part of geographic information systems, which is a very popular technology today. Oftentimes people say GIS could represent quite a few things. If you're talking about the GI services, this is a major growing economic sector. If you contrast, in the middle, that's representing the geo services and the global airline industry. That's almost 1/3 of the global airline industry annual revenue. So it's a major economy, but in terms of sciences, so many different science domains are currently using GIS as a tool for their scientific problem solving. So what we're talking about here, we're using Blue Waters to come up with a new problem-solving approach for this redistricting problem. But GIS analytics, in fact, represent a broad spectrum of analytics requiring not only high-end computers like Blue Waters, but also clouds, Mad Cloud or Happy Cloud, what have you these days. And we see an opportunity and also challenge to come up with a new ecosystem of tools to be able to enable these analytics at scale. And of course, one of the attractive aspects is this kind of utilities getting accessed by millions of users and getting accessed by so many different scientific problem-solving practices. And at the same time, we're coming up with the kind of toolkit, the basic scalable computational utilities, as I was talking about, the parallel genetic algorithm library. And we really have a tough, challenging, but potentially rewarding work to be done is to figure out the pathway forward, how to organize the new algorithms and the tools, and making this accessible to the broad scientific community. So NSF funded this project exactly help us figure out this space of understanding what are the scalable new methodology in the context of GIS for solving the kind of problems I was sharing with you, in this case, the redistricting optimization. So this project covers 9 institutions with industry. ASRI, as if you're familiar with GIS, is also partnering with us. And as you could see, the project is 5 years now. We're getting to the 4th year, getting related communities involved. You see the diversity of the communities, and in this case, political science and operations research is an example tackling this redistricting optimization problem. So one of the utilities created in the project is called CyberGIS Gateway, which is an online environment accessed by multiple science communities. These are the user distributions of this tool we've created, and this tool is also interoperable with the ArcGIS, the ASRI, the popular commercial tool, ArcGIS Online. So these 2 different environments could talk to each other. This diagram developed by ASRI colleagues, they showed how these 2 different environments could talk to each other through APIs and services. So we clearly recognize the importance of coming up with our scientific solutions and at the same time leveraging the mainstream technologies. And the parallel genetic algorithm is developed, as I mentioned, as a library. This library is in the process of getting incorporated into this open source repository for the CyberGIS utilities, includes other types of scalable codes, because this is rather new. The high-end computing progress in the geospatial problem-solving space is rather a recent phenomenon. This is very different from astrophysics and others. It represents both opportunities and the challenges. One of the challenges is education. So how do we bring up scientists such as from social sciences or humanities who are using GIS tools, solving tough problems, and running to big data needs to resolve scalability. And how do we work with those scientists, researchers, to break the barriers so that they could achieve their desirable research? And we're very mindful of that, and we're developing, as I was talking about, really a spectrum. This is what we call accessible. You could think of what is CyberGIS for millions of users, online environment, easy to access interface. But the toolkit is more of open source, scalable codes community development. I think I'm getting to the end. Of course, have to thank all. It's great to have their support to allow us to have fun. Blue Waters and Exceed. And if I have time, ready to take any questions you have. Thank you.